Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of the Creative Bias podcast. And people might be asking themselves, what the fuck is a creative bias? And I want to answer that question. A creative bias is like literally a inclination towards creativity at all times in any moment in your life. So anytime you have a decision to make, anytime you have a problem to solve, anytime you have an interaction, your default is, how do I do this in the most creative way possible? And in a business sense, creative bias is a creative consultancy that you and I have started that exists to help people and organizations build their creative muscles. And what does that mean? It means build their creative talent, build their ability to be creative, build their inclination to look for the creative solution to everything. And since you, Darla, named this little organization Creative Bias, I'd love it.
Co-named it.
We co-named it, but I called it Creative Awakening at first, which sounded like a coffee shop in like near Berkeley. And you were like, I think we could do better. So I'd just love to hear any like perspective you have before we then introduce ourselves on how you arrived at the name Creative Bias.
Sure. And I think also in terms of defining it, there's the flip side to that, right? Like our whole existence is to combat any negative bias towards creative within organizations. Mm-hmm. So a little bit of a, I guess, double, triple entendre there. Yeah. Because the whole reason we're even here is because I randomly asked you to write my recommendation letter for school.
See, this is amazing. And I wanted to get into this because, and we'll circle back to that, because I wanted to introduce ourselves through the lens of how we came together in this idea. And I thought that we could go back in time, like we had a little mini time machine to when we first crossed paths. And I want to hear from your perspective how it went down when you and I first crossed paths. I believe it was in 2020 when we were both working on the Samsung account at Publicis.
Correct. Also, like, are we allowed to say that? I guess.
We're allowed to say anything we want. It's a podcast. You can say whatever you want.
Yeah. So it was back in 2020. I don't know, the many times the world felt like it was ending.
Yes. I believe it was right in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing.
Yes. Peak chaotic era of 2020. And yeah, we were working on a DE&I project together. Right. So we came together for what we called Brave Space. And thank God, because you were the only one generous enough to like offer their time to be my sponsor for that within the organization. Because everyone was just so busy.
The reason why I volunteered was because I remember very clearly being like, this is a person who is like grabbing the bull by the horns and not worrying about the risks associated with doing that. And in that moment in time, I was like, people like that, young people who are willing to grab the bull by the horns and grab a leadership position, need all the support that they can get. And if me being an old white dude is good for anything, it's to like throw whatever weight I had behind that cause.
Love that. That was your perspective on it, because that's exactly what it was. Although I don't know that I fully knew that that's what I was doing at the time, because much like you, I think it was even younger people and more junior people that came to me and were just like, Carla, like at the time, that's what everyone called me. They were just like, hey, we need a space to talk about shit that's going on outside of these fucking emails and outside of these presentations. Like,
and I felt like you saw the opportunity where like, I know how to nurture this. I know how to help.
Yes. And if I didn't, I was going to figure it out. I think that was the honest reaction, was like, I agree. I fully support that that's something we need for like psychological health within this organization. And I think it turned out to be something I could have never fathomed. And it was great. And my experience with you was like, I think we're both kind of people who give subject matter, the attention that it needs, and like the maturity that it needs, but we're also people who like don't take ourselves that fucking seriously.
Right.
Which is also why I think people felt comfortable talking to us about anything and everything in those conversations. So that's how we met.
That's how we met. And then, as I recall it, you then maybe shortly thereafter, or not so shortly thereafter, made the decision to leave Publicis and go back to school. And catch me up on the timeline or refresh my memory. But then there was a moment where you reached out to me and asked me if I would write a recommendation letter for a postgraduate program that you were applying for.
Correct. Yes. When you put it that way, it sounds like it happened so fast. It didn't. It felt like it took eternities. I left because I was so inspired by the work that we were doing and the feedback that I was getting. And I was like, maybe this is what I should do instead of project management. But there really wasn't a bottom line for it.
Totally. Right.
And so I kind of had this feeling of, if I can't get a seat at the table here, I'm going to have to create my own. Literally, when we got back from the holidays, like New Year's 2022, I put in my notice that I was leaving. And literally the weekend after my last day, I started life coaching training at Lumia. And started my own practice by February. And then that's when I decided to go back to school, which was 2023. It was kind of a shot in the dark. I was like, I'm going to apply for this program because it seems to align with my interests as well as a really legitimate way to scale my business. And that was the Spirituality, Mind and Body Institute program at Columbia University at the Teachers College. It's a master's program for psychology and education. And I completed it in 1 year, literally going to get my diploma this month.
Yeah. I think one of the things, so while you were on that journey, I was on a similar but parallel journey where I continued to work at Publicis until middle of 23, when I then hit a point where I was burnt out and I was questioning whether I thought my talents were being deployed in the best way within the agency ecosystem and all of that. And so I left and I started a whole bunch of stuff, did a bunch of creative projects, did consulting, and along the way, because of a conversation I had with someone else, I decided that I wanted to get trained as a life coach. And that's when I reached out to you because I knew that you had gotten trained as a life coach. And I wanted to find out where you got your training and if you would recommend it and all of that.
Which caught me by such surprise. Can I just tell you, like, I literally just felt like when I asked you to write my recommendation letter for Columbia, like it was just a one-off. And like when I read it, I literally started sobbing and I read it to my friends. And every time I read it to my friends, like I'd get choked up because I had no idea, like in the little interactions that we had, that you saw me. And that is also where you described me as someone who had a bias for action.
Yep, absolutely.
And then that's where we landed on creative bias, because I think that that's ultimately what we're trying to create. And I'd never heard someone describe me that way before.
Yeah.
And so when we were trying to come up, it was really important to me that we came up with a name that it wasn't like, oh, Darla came up with this, Steve came up with it, like whatever. Totally. I think it was a perfect marriage of our whole,
what is it, gestalt?
Yeah.
Is that the proper way to use that term? Probably not. Like, I really meant that you had a bias towards action, because I think it's really funny. I think in a lot of ad agency settings, there is a bias towards inaction. There is a bias towards, well, maybe if we just ignore it, it'll go away. Or there's a bias towards, what did we do last year? Maybe we could just change the dates on the presentation and represent that. And now you're seeing it too with like AI. There's just a bias towards let someone else do it. Let the collective wisdom of all of humanity that has been ingested by Gemini or ChatGPT or whatever it is solve the problem. And I think that that's a huge problem. And that's why I had this idea of, can I use consulting and coaching methodologies and sort of marry them to help people and organizations discover their own untapped creativity and grow it. Because, I talk about this a lot, but I think that creativity is the most important thing in the world. I think it's at the root of everything that we as human beings find comfort in. I think it's at the root of everything that helps us improve who we are, is when we're creating things and when we're imagining and trying to make the things that are in our imagination real. And I think it makes us better to each other. There's definitely data that says we become more empathetic the more creative activations or creative exercises we put ourselves into and through. And then just like creativity is at the root of everything that's ever made money, right? Like you had an idea and you said, I'm going to ask someone to pay me for this idea. So I'm going to try to make this idea as cool as I can. And without creativity, none of that happens. And so I think we're at this weird inflection point culturally where creativity is kind of in a tailspin in a lot of ways. And I don't think that's cool. I want to do whatever I can to help companies, people, teams get more creative so that they can have better results and better outcomes.
Yeah. And I think it's important that we kind of have already had our boots on the ground in like that real life experience of what it's like to be in that environment, how people work well together or they don't, and where bottlenecks are and what's killing your creative process.
And I think it's very interesting that like I was kind of playing with this thought exercise of like, does creativity still matter in business? And I was like, well, if I ask business people that, they'll all say yes. They'll all be like, yeah, of course, for sure. Absolutely. Yes. You got to be creative. You got to come up with new ideas. You have to innovate. But then you ask yourself the question, okay, if it's really important, then why is the product of so many companies like not creative? And why, for instance, is the number one driver of our economy right now this monoculture, which is AI, which is a bubble? And why do sequels and regurgitated IP tend to do better at the box office than more original, arguably creative work? And why in one genre of music does every song sound like every other song, more or less? And I think the answer to that, and I'm interested to hear your opinion because you have an interesting perspective as a project manager because you see teams kind of try to solve these problems. But I think that a big problem is we are incredibly risk averse as a society right now. And there's probably lots of reasons for that. I think one of the reasons is availability of data. We just have data that in theory can tell us what's going to work and what's not going to work. And so if you are trying to make money, why would you do something that's more risky than less risky? But I think that limits your growth. I don't think you can ever have an upside that's as high as it could be if you're only hewing to like what the data tells you is going to be successful. But I'd love to do you have a perspective on like what is the barrier to creativity in organizations?
Sure. And I think I actually have a sort of two-sided perspective, right? Because in project management or as a project manager, I want to say before I left or before I went to school, it was my whole job to mitigate risk.
Right.
My whole job is literally to pick out the worst outcome and do everything in my power to make sure that doesn't happen.
Right. Oh, totally.
And it's because that's our programming. Our brains are wired to mitigate for risk as much as possible for our own survival. And so what happens is, as humans, because of whatever our programming is, instead of going towards a new idea, we're risk averse because we're not going towards what's good for us or bad. Like, this is why people smoke. This is why people go back to their ex. It's not, you know what I mean? It's not.
I feel like
this is a good thing for me.
You're reading a list of things I've done in my life. So
yeah, I mean, all of us. No, another podcast for another time. Yeah, because we're not programmed to go for what's good for us. We're programmed to go to what's familiar. And so that's why it's so natural for us to be risk averse. But
yeah, it's interesting. There was a time where I was in charge of innovation at the agency, and I always found it funny that anytime I would bring stuff that was very speculative, I'd be like, you guys should check this out, or you guys should make an investment in this nascent business. They'd look at me like, I was crazy. Like, well, how do you know it's going to work? And I'd be like, well, I don't. That's the point. It's innovation. It's like, it is speculative, and there's upside and there's downside. And that's the way the world works. Because I think if you don't have a good relationship with risk, you just can't really be creative. Okay. So I wanted to talk about, like, as creative bias, what is it that we really practically do for clients who say, I need to make my team more creative, or I need to make this organization more creative, or I need to develop my own creativity, and how we go about sort of helping teams do that. I think there's like a couple of principles we really believe in. And one of them is we need to be more connected as people and as teams if we want to get the most out of creativity. One of the things that I've seen with a bunch of organizations that I've worked with is this kind of like disconnected creativity or disconnected ideation is like the worst thing you can do for being creative, because what happens is you'll have a creative team or a creative person go away, come up with an idea in isolation, and then they take it up the chain and they take it to their boss, or they take it to finance, or they take it to legal, or whoever it is. And then finance or legal or the boss or whoever it is says, that's too risky, or that's too expensive, or it's not going to work probably. And then the idea dies, and then the person has to circle back around and come up with a new idea and blah, blah, blah. And so I'm a big believer and proponent, and I'm interested in your perspective from, like, again, the project management lens. I'm a huge believer that the more we can get people to ideate.
Well, I think actually when you were talking, the first thing that came to mind, being disconnected or disconnected, even before that, the belief that you are a creative person and like fully like being grounded in that as a group and as an individual is where we need to start, right? Because you hear it all, it's like, oh, I'm not a creative person. Well, this is why you're just basing everything you do off of data. And so how do you, before you even get to like building a creative muscle, right? You have to identify the problem first. And we are what we believe we are. And if we believe we're not creative people, we're not going to create.
Absolutely. But you used a phrase there that I really liked, and I'd like to hear more about it. Creative muscle. So we talk about that a lot, and we talk about helping people build their creative muscle. And I think about that sort of like, obviously an analog is when you go to the gym, and it's not just one muscle. There's all types of muscles, and there's all like different ways to train your muscles. So when we think about creative muscles, what is the value proposition of that? Is it just that, like, hey, I want to have a more attractive culture to potential employees, or I want to retain my employees because I'm seen as a creative organization? Or like, what is the impetus? What is the necessity behind growing and building your creative muscles?
Yeah. So I think, if we want to use the analogy to its full extent, right? You think of a muscle, you go to a gym to work it out, and it's not muscles, just like creativity. It's not like you're born with it or you're not. Everybody has muscles. Everybody is born as a creative to a certain extent.
Yep.
It's a matter of how much you're cultivating it or not cultivating it, using it or not using it. And the thing is, it's like if you have a brainstorm once a quarter, that's going to be the extent of your creativity, right? Just like if you go to the gym every 3 months, well,
right.
Flabtastic,
Right. And you just do curls.
Yeah. Exhibit A. But yeah, so I think that that's the importance and value proposition of creative bias and building creative muscle.
I think of creative muscle in terms of Jason Bourne, which I don't know if you're a fan of the Jason Bourne movies.
I'm familiar. I'm not a fan.
But like, Jason Bourne, what made him so great was he was good at a ton of stuff. Like, he was good at fighting, I think. He was probably good at shooting a gun. He was good at like maybe wearing a disguise or getting a fake passport. I think he was probably good at that. He was good at like tricking people into like thinking he went one way, but he really went another way. He was good at running. And I feel like that's what I mean when I say, or when I think of creative muscle. It's like, the more you practice creativity and the more you train creativity, the more you can do lots of different things creatively. And the value of that is like, let's just be honest. We live in a crazy world. Like we live in a crazy world. And I'm not going to say we live in a world that's crazier than it's ever been. Maybe it's always been crazy. I don't know. But I will say that in the last 5 years, like 100 things that I never thought would happen, could happen in my lifetime have happened. And I think that we see that like across lots of different arenas in business, in politics, in public health, in what, you name it. We've seen unprecedented stuff. And I think we're going to keep seeing more and more unprecedented stuff. And so the value, the very necessity of creative muscle is that you need to be prepared for like things you can't even imagine right now. And that requires creative muscles that are like ready to go and ready to fire and ready to fast twitch at a moment's notice, because you're going to have to react to something that you did not see coming and you weren't, your competitors are not going to be prepared for.
In order to be resilient, which I know is your...
I do love resilience.
Yeah.
I'm a big resilience person because I think like it's now we're turning this into a movie podcast, but it's the old Ferris Bueller line of like life comes at you pretty fast.
This weekend, yeah.
Wait, you just watched Ferris Bueller this weekend?
Yeah.
So good. It's such a good movie. So creative muscle for the purpose of the fact that like you never know where you're going to need to exert creative force. And the better you can get at anticipating or being prepared for those things, the better off you are. Agility.
Essence. Yeah.
Exactly. I also think that we've talked a little bit about risk and people's relationship with risk. And this is something that I've said this to multiple consulting clients over the years, that you can have two things in business and you need to have really one of them, at least one of them, if you want to be successful. And the first thing you can have if you really want to be successful is a ton of money, because money is leverage. Money helps you paper over mistakes. Money helps you make marketplaces. Money helps you get rid of the competition. Money helps you acquire the competition. We live in very monopoly-friendly times. But if you don't have a lot of money, what you need is a very big appetite for risk and a very like agile, resilient way of dealing with risk. And I'll give you an example of a client that I was working with somewhat recently, and I'm not going to name any names because I'm not trying to put anybody on blast. But I was working with a company, and an NFL player, a very famous NFL player, in an interview said the name of this company's product. He wasn't referring to the product specifically. He was using the word in a different context, but he said it. And he said whatever the product was. Let's say it's, we'll use the classic widgets. He said, I want a lot of widgets. And so I said, my recommendation was at that guy in a social media post and send him a bunch of widgets. And the client was like, well, we don't have a deal with that person. We don't have a deal with the league. What if he doesn't like us adding him in a post? And my thing was like, well, what if he does?
Right.
Because if he doesn't, like, be real, look risk in the eye. If he doesn't, what's going to happen? If he doesn't, he's going to say, take it down. And you'll take it down. And the thing with this client was they didn't have a lot of money at all. They had next to no money. And my point to them was, you guys have to get more comfortable taking a risk if you want to grow. Because you had an opportunity gift wrapped, on a silver platter, and you're like, nah, we don't want it, because what if something bad happens?
Right.
And I think that organizations, the best organizations, the organizations that have hockey stick growth up into the right, whatever, are organizations that at one point in their history were like, yeah, we're taking the risk. I'm taking the risk. I'm going to ask, Jeff Bezos asked his whole family for as much money as they could give him to start Amazon. Amazon shouldn't have succeeded the way it did, right? It's a great idea, But there were so many things that could have gone wrong that could have killed Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
But he was like, I'm taking the risk because it's worth it, because I believe in this insight. Same thing with, I don't know, an electric car company. People aren't ready for electric cars. The infrastructure is not there. But if you don't do it now, you're never going to do it. So you got to do it. So you got to take those risks. And if I could give one gift to any client I ever have, to any company, and even like the people who make up those companies, it would be more comfortable taking risks and get smarter about how you evaluate those risks, look those risks in the eye and understand like what is the upside and what's the downside and what can you live with and what will you not be able to live with yourself for if you don't do. And that's kind of why I think creative bias exists.
Yeah. Just to bring it back full circle, someone, I think it was a client or maybe it was a colleague, they asked me, they're like, you know, what is coaching? Like, and I always said, I was like, well, it's really just like asking questions to like drag out the wisdom you already have in you. And randomly they were like, well, what's your favorite question to ask? I jokingly, but dead ass seriously said, I was like, to be perfectly honest with you, I love it when we get to the point here, what you're talking about, this like threshold of their risk, like willingness.
Yep.
And I will literally say, what would it take for you to fuck around and find out? Because we always land there. That's always where we go. We're programmed to go to, what if it doesn't work out?
Right. Right.
And so not even just what if it does, what would it take for you? Because now you're getting them to think about what you said. Can I live with myself?
Totally.
Or can we survive as a company if we don't take this risk?
100%. And I think like, you know, I always say that like musicians, their best albums are their first because they don't really understand what's at stake when they're writing it. And then after that, they're too successful. So they like maybe start trying to give the audience what they think the audience wants, as opposed to like, I'm going to give the audience what was in my heart or my mind or whatever. And I think that like that really also shows up in business, where you see businesses who have a great business idea and then they have success and then they try to protect their success and they stop taking risks and they stop innovating. And that's death for a business. You know, I think every one of us has a million examples in our lives like that, of taking the bet on yourself, taking the bet on, I'm going to be optimistic that this risk is going to work out. And I think that's another, you know, sort of like piece of the definition of how to be creative is you got to be a little bit optimistic, sometimes irrationally optimistic, sometimes exuberantly optimistic. And I'm not saying like, don't be thoughtful, don't underpin your risks or the decisions you make with data and evidence. You should. I'm a huge believer in data and evidence. But in the world of business, in the world of marketing, in the world of brand building, in the world of whatever,
Never been done before.
Never been done before. Right? Oh my God, that's so good. Let's talk about that. It's an inside joke, but let's make it an outside joke because Darla and I both worked on Samsung, and Samsung for the entire time I worked on them was always like, we want never been done befores. And then you'd be like, okay, do this. And they'd be like, I don't know. Why should we do that? Well, but you said you wanted never been done before. But what if it doesn't work? Well, how am I supposed to know if it's going to work if I've never done it before?
All right. So
the aspiration is good. It's the behavior behind the aspiration that has to match up. And frankly, to give Samsung their flowers, I think a lot of organizations would be better off if they set that as the bar, because
that was the ask every time.
Yeah, it makes you,
at least for part of it. You know what I mean?
100%. And I never liked those words because I found those words to be unnecessarily boxy, in that they kind of put you into a box because you would come up with an idea.
It feels finite in a way.
Yeah. And you go, well, it kind of has been done before, because like kind of everything's been done before. So you weren't meant to take that literally.
Right.
But the inspiration of like, let's do something that we haven't done before, or let's do something that new, or let's apply something. is really good. And I think that companies should think with that sort of a worldview. Like, let's try to do something that people haven't seen before, or haven't seen from us before, or haven't seen frequently before. And I just feel like the world is losing its appetite for stuff like that. And if we can be the organization that helps to like hairpin that and turn it around and say, no, we're going to start taking bigger risks and we're going to start demanding more net new creativity, the world will be a better place for it.
And we love it because that's how it's going to be the first time. You have to be willing to take a risk. You have to be willing to not be great at it to start. You know what I mean?
I absolutely know what you mean. And the other thing I'll say about taking risks and then failing is that's how you learn. And if you're an organization, if you're a company, if you're a brand, if you're an individual and you don't like to learn, then don't take risks. By all means, sit there, just follow the playbook. You'll go out of business pretty soon, but like, don't take risks if you don't like. But if you like to learn, you got to take risks because you learn better through failing than through succeeding. I'll say one last thing before we wrap this up. People might sort of have a question about like, so you guys are consultants, but you're also coaches, and how do those two things live together? And maybe why do those things live together? And my perspective on that is that when you're a consultant, you kind of walk in and you go, I've seen this all before. I know the answers, and here, follow my playbook and we'll solve your problem. And coaches, to your point earlier, Darla, like it's about asking questions, and it's asking questions in the pursuit of uncovering the knowledge and the truth that lives inside of the person, or in this case, the organization. And so what you learn in coaching is that there are no one size fits all answers. Everything has to be personal to the individual that you're coaching, or in this case, the organization that you're coaching will have its own set of dynamics that you have to like fold into how to become more creative, how to build your creative muscles. And so the reason to work with Creative Bias is that we really respect the dynamics of your organization and will inspect them and understand them along the way as we help to develop your creative muscles. T, and that's T. Okay. I think that's all we have to say for this episode of the Creative Bias Podcast. Anything to close with, Darla, or are we good here?
I mean, this is us. Slide in our DMs, you know?
This is us jumping on DMs. All right. Thank you for listening. And Darla, thank you for co-authoring this podcast.